The air in the cabin is thick with the coppery tang of old blood and the silence of a place waiting for death. Elspeth stands frozen in the doorway, the handle of her worn carpet bag digging into her palm. This is not the welcome a mail-order bride expects. There is no gruff but decent man waiting, no neat table set for a first meal. There is only a body on a cot, a man half drowned in his own blood, his breathing a shallow, ragged whisper. He is meant to be her husband, Jedediah Stone, the man whose letters promised a simple, sturdy life. Instead, he looks like a man whose life is all but over. Panic, cold and sharp, tries to claw its way up her throat, but she swallows it down. Panic is a luxury. For a woman who has traveled 1,000 miles with nothing but a spare dress and a desperate hope, it is an indulgence she cannot afford. Her gaze sweeps the squalid one-room cabin. A stone hearth, a crude table, and a near-empty sack of flour leaning against the wall. It's that sack that catches her eye. A memory surfaces, a grim tale her grandmother used to tell about the old wars, about field medics using flour and cobwebs to pack wounds when nothing else was to be had. A fool's remedy, a last resort. She looks at the man on the cot, his life seeping into the thin mattress. She is already at the last resort. With a deep, shuddering breath, she drops her bag, her decision made. She will not let her new life end before it has even begun. With trembling hands, she rips open the sack of flour, knowing it is a fool's hope. But it was the only hope she had. That was a close call. Before we see how Elspeth navigates this, tell us in the comments, what's the toughest situation you've ever had to survive? And if you admire pure grit, hit that like button and subscribe. Her future, so carefully constructed from a handful of letters and a train ticket paid for with the last of her inheritance, now rested on the failing pulse of a stranger. This man, Jedediah Stone, was supposed to be her sanctuary. His letters, written in a surprisingly neat and thoughtful hand, had spoken of the quiet dignity of a land, of building a life from the soil and sweat. He'd painted a picture of hardship, yes, but also of honesty and partnership. He had not mentioned he was prone to getting himself shot. Now, that dream of a simple life lay bleeding out on a dirty cot. The choice to run, to take her chances in the nearest town, flickered through her mind. She could walk away. No one would blame her. But the nearest town, Jericho Forks, was a 2-day walk, and she had seen the faces of the men there when she'd asked for directions to the Stone homestead. They were hard, assessing faces, eyes that stripped a lone woman of her dignity and saw only opportunity or burden. There was no safety for her there. Here, in this blood-soaked cabin, was a different kind of danger, but one she might be able to fight. Her world had shrunk to these 4 walls, and the life or death of the man within them. The journey west had been an act of calculated desperation. At 19, Elspeth Gable was an orphan with no prospects beyond a life of thankless servitude in a dreary boarding house back east. She'd scrubbed floors and laundered linens for her keep, her hands perpetually raw, her spirit slowly eroding under the weight of condescending pity. The advertisement for a mail-order bride had been a lifeline. Mr. Jedediah Stone of the Montana Territory sought a wife. He was, by his own admission, a man of modest means, with a small homestead carved out of the wilderness. He promised respect, a home, and a full belly, if not a life of ease. To Elspeth, that was a kingdom. The man on the cot, however, looked like he hadn't had a full belly in weeks. He was lean to the point of gaunt, his face obscured by a rough beard and grimed with dirt and dried blood. A dark, ugly stain spread from a hole high on his ribs, soaking the rough spun shirt and the blanket beneath. His breathing was a terrible, wet sound. Elspeth moved past her fear, her mind shifting into the practical, methodical state she adopted when faced with an overwhelming task. First, water. She found a bucket by the door and hurried to the creek she'd crossed on her way up the path to the cabin. The water was bitingly cold, a shock that cleared the last vestiges of her hesitation. She filled the bucket and hauled it back inside, her resolve hardening with every step. She tore a strip from her own spare petticoat, the fine cotton a stark contrast to the grimy surroundings. The wound was worse than she had imagined. It was a ragged, angry hole, the flesh around it already inflamed. Someone had shot him, and not long ago. Who? And why? The questions were a swarm of angry hornets in her mind, but she pushed them away. They didn't matter now. Survival mattered. With gritted teeth, she began to clean the wound. The man groaned, a low, animal sound of pure agony, and his body arched on the cot. His eyes, cloudy with fever, fluttered open for a second. They were a startlingly clear blue, a patch of summer sky in a storm-racked face. They held no recognition, only pain, before they slid shut again. "Hold on," she whispered, her voice rough. "Just hold on, Mr. Stone." Once the wound was as clean as she could get it, she turned to the flour sack. Her grandmother's words echoed in her memory. "It draws out the fever heat and seals the blood." It had sounded like folk nonsense then. Now it sounded like scripture. She mixed a thick paste of flour and cold creek water in a tin bowl. It felt foolish, like a child making mud pies. But when she began to pack the paste into and around the wound, the logic, desperate as it was, became clear. It formed a thick, pliable seal, a crude dam against the steady seep of his life's blood. The man shuddered violently as the cold paste touched his feverish skin, but his bleeding, blessedly, seemed to slow. She worked until she was satisfied, her hands and arms coated in the white, sticky mixture. When she was done, she covered her handiwork with another clean strip of her petticoat and bound it tightly around his chest. It was a makeshift, barbaric piece of medicine, but it was done. Exhaustion hit her like a physical blow. She sank onto the single rickety chair, her body trembling with reaction. The cabin was silent now, save for the man's breathing, which already seemed a fraction less ragged. In the fading light, the isolation of the place settled around her. The homestead was nestled in a tight, wooded valley, miles from any neighbor, a tiny island of human effort in a vast, indifferent wilderness. The wind soughed through the pines, a lonely, mournful sound. He had written of solitude, but this was something more profound. This was a place a man came to disappear. That first night was the longest of her life. She dozed fitfully in the chair, a heavy iron skillet resting on her lap. Whoever had shot him might come back to finish the job. Every creak of the cabin walls, every rustle in the woods outside, sent a jolt of fear through her. She was no longer just Elspeth Gable, the hopeful bride. She was a sentry, a nurse, the sole guardian of a flickering life. Sometime before dawn, he began to mutter. The words were disjointed, nonsensical, torn from him by the fever. Names she didn't know, Corbin, Silas. Fragments of sentences. This seemed deeper than we thought. My claim, damn you, and one word, repeated over and over like a prayer or a curse. Stanton wasn't his name. It was another piece of a puzzle she couldn't begin to solve. She bathed his face with a cool cloth, murmuring soothing nonsense, the way one would to a frightened animal. He was burning up, his skin radiating a dry, punishing heat. The flower poultice would need be changed. The wound would need to be cleaned again. The long, slow battle had only just begun. As the first pale light of morning filtered through the single grimy window, Elspeth looked from the sleeping, fevered man to the wild country outside. She had come here seeking a home and a husband. What she had found was a patient and a war. And as she rose to fetch more water from the creek, she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that she would not retreat. This was her ground now. She would hold it. The days bled into one another, each a cycle of grim, repetitive tasks. Elspeth's world shrank to the rhythm of Jedediah's breathing, the heat of his fever, and the state of the gruesome wound in his side. Twice a day, she would steel herself, unwrap the crude bandage, and scrape away the hardened, blood-caked flour. Each time, she expected to find the putrid stench of infection, the dark spread of gangrene that would signal the end. And each time, she was met with angry, inflamed flesh that was miraculously still fighting. The wound was knitting itself together, slowly, painfully. The flour, against all logic, seemed to be working. It staunched the bleeding and seemed to draw the worst of the inflammation to the surface, which she would then carefully clean away. She learned the landscape of his unconsciousness. The fever would take him to dark places, and he would thrash against her, his voice a raw growl as he fought invisible demons. He spoke of rock and shadow, of veins of gold glimmering like trapped stars. He cursed the names Corbin and Silas, his words thick with betrayal. It was a partnership, he'd cry out, his hands clenching into fists. The Stanton claim, mine by right. Stanton, the name again. It was clearly important. She began to suspect that Jedediah Stone was a name as makeshift as the flower bandage on his chest. It was a name a man would choose for a quiet life, a life of hiding. But what was he hiding from? Or what was he hiding? To keep them both alive, she had to learn the cabin and its surroundings. She was a city girl. Her knowledge of the wild gleaned from books. Now, necessity was her teacher. She found his meager larder, some beans, dried jerky, coffee, and the precious flour. It wouldn't last. She discovered his rifle, a heavy Winchester, propped in a corner. She knew the basics of how to load and fire, her father having insisted on it years ago, a strange piece of education for a girl in a bustling town. She took it with her when she ventured out, her senses on high alert. She learned to check the snares he had set in the woods, finding a rabbit in one on the third day. The task of skinning and cleaning it was bloody and repugnant, but the smell of the meat stewing over the fire was the scent of victory. She found a small, neglected garden patch behind the cabin, where a few hardy potato plants and some wild onions still grew. She dug them up with her bare hands, the dirt cool and real beneath her fingernails. The cabin itself slowly gave up its secrets. It was a simple, solid structure built to endure. But there were incongruities. Tucked away on a high shelf, half hidden behind a stack of tin plates, was a small collection of books. Not the Bible or a farmer's almanac, but volumes of geology, Shakespearean tragedies, and worn Greek philosophy. A man who called himself a simple homesteader did not, as a rule, read Plato in the original Greek. His clothes, though worn, were of a finer cut and quality than any farmer's. And one afternoon, while sweeping the dirt floor, her broom caught on a loose floorboard beneath the cot. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Slowly, carefully, she pried it up. Beneath it was a hollowed-out space. Inside lay a leather satchel. Her hands trembled as she lifted it. It was heavy, far heavier than it should have been. Untying the leather thong, she peeked inside. It was not full of coins. It was full of raw, unrefined gold. Dozens of nuggets, from the size of a pea to a few as large as her thumb, nestled amongst a pouch of shimmering gold dust. It was a fortune, a king's ransom. She dropped the floorboard back into place, her mind reeling. Jedediah Stone, the humble homesteader, was a lie. This man, whoever he was wealthy beyond her wildest imaginings. And someone had tried to kill him for it. Corbin and Silas, the partners he'd cursed in his fever. The knowledge changed everything and nothing. He was still the wounded man on the cot, his life still in her hands. But now, the shadows outside the cabin felt deeper, more menacing. She wasn't just guarding a man, she was guarding a treasure. The creak of a branch, the call of an owl, now sounded like a footstep, a signal. One evening, about a week into her vigil, she saw them. Two riders on the ridge opposite the valley, their figures silhouetted against the blood-red sunset. They sat on their horses, motionless, just watching the cabin. A cold dread washed over her. It had to be them, Corbin and Silas. They had come back to see if their work was done, to see if the cabin was empty and the gold theirs for the taking. She quickly doused the small fire, plunging the cabin into near darkness. She grabbed the Winchester, her hands clammy, and crouched by the window, peering through a tiny gap in the shutter. The men on the ridge didn't move for a long time. They were patient. They thought they had all the time in the world. They thought their victim was dead or dying, and a lone woman who had arrived by wagon was no threat. Finally, as true darkness fell, they turned their horses and disappeared over the ridge. They would be back. She knew it with chilling certainty. That night, the fever broke. She was dozing in her chair when a sound startled her awake. It was a voice, quiet and hoarse, but clear. Water. She jerked upright. Jedediah was awake. His eyes were open, and for the first time they were lucid. The startling blue was no longer clouded by pain or delirium. They were focused on her. Her heart leaped. She rushed to his side with a dipper of cool water. Easy now, she said, her voice unsteady. She helped him lift his head, and he drank greedily. He sank back onto the cot, his gaze sweeping the cabin before landing back on her face. He took in her tired, smudged face, her worn dress, the skillet still resting near a chair. "Who?" he began, his voice a dry rasp. "Elspeth Gable," she said softly. I'm your mail-order bride." A flicker of something, confusion, memory, regret, crossed his face. He remembered. He remembered sending the letters, making the arrangement. He tried to push himself up, a grimace of pain twisting his features as he felt the pull in his side. "The wound," she said quickly, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "You've been shot. You need to lie still." He looked down at his bandaged chest, then back at her. "How long?" 9 days, she answered. His eyes widened in disbelief. 9 days. He had lost 9 days of his life. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw the deep exhaustion etched around her eyes, the determined set of her jaw. He saw the empty pot on the hearth, the neatly stacked firewood she must have gathered, the rifle leaning within easy reach. This woman, this stranger he had contracted for, had not run. She had stayed. She had fought for him. "You saved my life," he said, the words simple, heavy with a truth that filled the small cabin. "I used flour and creek water," she replied, a faint, wry smile touching her lips for the first time in over a week. "Don't thank me until you're sure it won't kill you yet." A low chuckle, which turned into a painful cough, escaped him. "Flour. It was all I had," she said, her smile fading. She looked toward the window, toward the dark ridge where the riders had been. "We don't have much time. They'll be back." His expression hardened. The brief moment of relief was gone, replaced by the grim reality he had woken up to. "You saw them. 2 riders. This evening, watching from the ridge." He closed his eyes, a muscle working in his jaw. "Corbin," he breathed. The name was no longer a fevered curse, but a cold statement of fact. He wouldn't leave it. Not while he thinks the gold is still here. So it was true. All of it. The gold, the betrayal. She looked at the man on the cot. No longer just a patient, but a partner in a siege. Her simple life was a distant memory. But as she met his clear, steady gaze, she felt a surprising lack of fear. In its place was a hard, cold resolve. They had shot her intended husband. They had threatened her home. They had made this her fight, too. "Well," she said, picking up the heavy skillet and placing it decisively on the hearth, "they'll find we are not as easily removed as they might hope." His eyes held hers, a silent, understanding passing between them. In that moment, she was no longer just the mail-order bride and he the wounded homesteader. They were 2 people bound by a shared threat, a shared secret, and a life saved with a sack of flour. The days that followed took on a new texture. The cabin was no longer a silent infirmary, but a quiet war room. Jedediah, or Jed as he now insisted she call him, recovered his strength with a stubborn, frustrating slowness. He was a terrible patient, railing against his own weakness. He would try to stand, only to collapse back onto the cot, his face pale and beaded with sweat, cursing his own body. Elspeth, in turn, became an unyielding taskmaster, doling out broth and orders with equal authority. "If you tear those stitches, I'll sew you up with fishing line," she warned, her tone leaving no room for argument. "Now eat." He would glare at her, but he would eat. A strange, unspoken intimacy grew between them in the small, shared space. It was an intimacy born not of romance, but of utter necessity. She changed his bandages, her touch professional and sure, ignoring the flinch of his muscles and the proximity of his bare skin. He, in turn, began to talk, not about the gold or the men who were hunting him, but about the land. He taught her how to read the weather in the clouds, how to identify the tracks of deer and coyote near the creek. He told her about the cabin, how he'd built it himself, felling the timber and setting the stone for the hearth with his own hands. "I wanted a place that was honest," he said one afternoon, his gaze distant. "Just wood and stone and hard work. Something real." Elspeth listened, piecing together the man from these fragments. The man who read Greek philosophy and built his own shelter. The man who sought a simple life, but had stumbled upon a treasure that had nearly cost him everything. She found herself watching him, the way he moved, the focus in his eyes. She saw the strength in his hands, even as they trembled with weakness. She was beginning to see the man he was, not the man he pretended to be or the patient he had been. She never mentioned the floorboard or the satchel of gold. She waited for him to tell her. It became a silent test of the trust that was slowly, cautiously building between them. The riders on the ridge became a constant, unnerving presence. They appeared most evenings at dusk, two dark specters against the dying light. They were biding their time, letting the wilderness and starvation do their work for them. They underestimated her. They did not know that Jed was awake, that his strength was returning. They did not know that the woman in the cabin was more resourceful than they could ever imagine. One morning, she returned from checking her snares, empty again, to find Jed sitting on the edge of the cot, dressed in his trousers and shirt. He was pale and unsteady, but he was upright. In his lap, he was carefully cleaning the Winchester. "What do you think you're doing?" she demanded, her heart leaping with a mixture of fear and anger. "Getting ready," he said, his voice quiet but firm. He didn't look at her. "They won't wait forever, Elsie. Their greed is stronger than their patience. They'll make a move soon." He called her Elsie. No one had ever called her Elsie. It was a soft, gentle sound, a stark contrast to the cold metal of the rifle in his hands. "You can barely stand," she said, her voice softer now. "I can shoot sitting down," he retorted. He finally looked up at her, and his blue eyes were deadly serious. "There's something you need to know, the whole truth. It's not fair to you to be in this without knowing." He told her everything. His real name was Jedediah Stanton. He wasn't a prospector by trade. He was a geologist from a wealthy family back east, a family he had estranged himself from, wanting to make his own way. He'd come west not for gold, but for the freedom of the mountains. The gold had been an accident, a geological anomaly he'd stumbled upon while surveying for a railroad company. A seam of quartz so rich with gold, it was almost a solid vein. Corbin and Silas were his partners, two rough prospectors he'd hired to help him work the claim. They had been friends, he'd thought. They'd shared whiskey and stories around the fire. But the sheer scale of the discovery had poisoned them. "It was too much," Jed said, his voice low with remembered pain. "It burns a hole in a man's soul, a fortune that size." They had waited until they'd hauled out the first major cache, the gold that was now hidden under the floorboards. Then they had shot him in the back, left him for dead, and fled, likely to register the claim in their own names, thinking him a ghost. But they must have realized he'd hidden the first haul, and that without it, their claim might be contested. So they had returned, circling like vultures, waiting for the cabin to fall silent forever. When he finished, the cabin was quiet. He had finally laid the truth bare. He looked at her, his expression vulnerable. "The satchel is under the floor," he said, confirming what she already knew. "It's more money than you can imagine. Enough to get you anywhere you want to go. You should take it and leave, Elsie. Tonight, while it's dark." Your agreement was with Jedediah Stone, a poor homesteader. That man doesn't exist. You owe Jedediah Stanton nothing. He was offering her an escape, a fortune and her freedom. It was more than she had ever dreamed of. She could go to San Francisco, to Denver, anywhere. She could buy a dress shop, a boarding house of her own. She could be a lady. She looked at him, sitting pale and determined on the edge of the cot, the heavy rifle across his knees. She looked around the small cabin she had fought to defend. She thought of the long nights listening to his breathing, of the shared fear and the quiet moments of connection. She thought of the respect in his eyes when he looked at her. He saw her not as a mail-order bride, a purchased commodity, but as an equal, a partner. To leave now would be to betray not just him, but herself and the woman she had become in this cabin. She walked over to the hearth, picked up her skillet, her first and most trusted weapon, and turned back to him. Her voice was steady, her decision absolute. "My agreement was with a man who promised me a home," she said. "This is my home, and I do not intend to be run out of it by two murdering thieves." She met his astonished gaze, a small, fierce smile on her face. "Now, show me how to properly load this rifle. It seems we have some preparations to make." Jedediah stared at her, a wave of emotion so powerful it left him breathless washing over him. He had offered her a fortune, and she had chosen him. She had chosen this fight. A slow smile spread across his face, the first genuine, unguarded smile she had ever seen from him. It transformed his weary features, revealing the handsome man beneath the hardship. "All right, Elsie," he said, his voice filled with a warmth that had nothing to do with any lingering fever. "Let's make our preparations." Their alliance was sealed. The cabin, once a place of mere survival, became a fortress. Jed, despite his weakness, possessed a sharp, tactical mind. He knew Corbin and Silas. He knew their greed, their impatience, and their brutality. "Corbin's the thinker," Jed explained, his voice low as they sat by the firelight, the rifle between them. "He's clever, but he's a coward at heart. Silas is the muscle. Mean as a snake and twice as fast, but he doesn't think past his next move. Corbin will plan the attack, but he'll send Silas in first." They planned their defense with meticulous care. Jed, still unable to move quickly, would take up a position by the main window, where he had a clear line of sight to the front path. Elspeth's job would be to move, to create confusion, to be an unexpected and unpredictable element. They barricaded the door with a heavy table and blocked the small back window with the cot's headboard. Elspeth's mind, honed by years of practical problem-solving, proved to be as valuable as Jed's rifle. "The hearth," she said, her eyes gleaming in the firelight. "The stone gets hot enough to boil water in minutes. And the floorboard over the cellar is loose here. By the pantry, they devised a series of small, desperate traps and diversions. A bucket of boiling water balanced precariously over the door. A tripwire made from twine near the woodpile. Every mundane object in the cabin was assessed for its potential as a weapon. The tension in the cabin was a living thing. They worked together in a state of heightened awareness, their movements economical, their conversations clipped and focused. Yet, in the quiet moments, a new dynamic emerged. As he showed her how the Winchester's loading mechanism worked, his hands guided hers, his touch lingering for a fraction of a second longer than necessary. When she brought him a cup of broth, her fingers brushed his, and a jolt of warmth passed between them. The ever-present danger stripped away all pretense, leaving only a raw, terrifying, and exhilarating honesty. They were no longer a prospective husband and wife bound by a sterile contract. There were two soldiers in a trench, their lives utterly dependent on one another. One night, as a storm raged outside, rattling the shutters and sending gusts of wine down the chimney, the fear became too much to hold in. Elspeth was staring into the fire, her hands clenched in her lap. "Are you scared?" Jed asked softly from a cot. She nodded, not trusting her voice. "Good," he said. "Fear keeps you sharp. Just don't let it rule you." He paused, his voice dropping lower. "Elsie, if things go badly, the gold is yours. All of it. You get out. You live a good life. You promise me." She turned to face him, her eyes flashing with a sudden fire. "We both get out, Jedediah Stanton," she said fiercely. "Or neither of us does. That's my promise." The storm passed, and the next day dawned with a brittle, unnerving stillness. The air was cold and clear. The birds were silent. They both felt it. The waiting was over. As dusk began to settle, they came. Not from the ridge this time, but from the trees at the edge of the clearing. Two figures moving low and fast. "It's them," Jed breathed, his knuckles white as he gripped the rifle stock. Elspeth's heart hammered against her ribs, a wild drumbeat of terror and adrenaline. She took her position near the hearth, the heavy iron skillet in one hand, a pot of water already steaming over the fire. A voice called out from the twilight, rough and impatient. "Stanton, we know you're in there, and we know you ain't alone. Send the woman out, and we might let her live." It was Silas, his voice a gravelly roar. Jed didn't answer. Silence was their best weapon. "Don't be a fool, Jed," a second voice called out, smoother, more cunning. "Corbin, we saw the wagon. We know she's here. It's over. We just want what's ours. The gold you stole from us." "The hypocrisy is breathtaking," Jed muttered to Elspeth, a flicker of dark humor in his eyes. He raised his voice just enough to carry. "The gold is mine, Corbin. The claim is in my name. You're the thieves." There was a moment of silence, and then the crack of a rifle shot. The bullet splintered the wood of the door, showering the interior with fragments. Elspeth flinched but held her ground. The battle had begun. They heard movement, a stealthy circling of the cabin. They were testing the defenses. Another shot shattered the window pane above Jed's head, spraying glass inwards. He didn't flinch, his eyes glued to the dark shapes moving in the trees. "Silas is coming around the back," Jed whispered, his senses preternaturally sharp. "Corbin will try the front door. He thinks he'll be focused on Silas." Elspeth nodded, her mouth dry. She moved silently to the back wall, peering through a small crack she had made earlier. She could just make out a large, hulking shape creeping toward the back window. Silas. At the front of the cabin, a heavy thud shook the door. Corbin was trying to break it down. "Now, Elsie," Jed commanded. His rifle roared, the sound deafening in the enclosed space. Outside, there was a cry of pain and surprise. Jed had aimed not for Corbin, but for the wood next to the door, a warning shot designed to drive him back. As Corbin scrambled for cover, Elspeth acted. With a strength she didn't know she possessed, she heaved the pot of scalding water. It wasn't aimed at Silas, but at the ground just below the back window. The water hit the cold earth with a loud hiss, sending up a plume of steam and creating a patch of treacherous, slick mud. Silas, startled by the rifle shot and the sudden commotion behind him, made his move. He charged the back window, intending to smash his way through. His heavy boot hit the mud patch Elspeth had created. With a comical yelp, his feet shot out from under him, and he went down hard, his head cracking against the cabin's foundation stones with a sickening thud. He lay still. "Silas is down," Elspeth cried, her voice trembling with the shock of her own success. At the front, Corbin let out a roar of fury. The brute force approach had failed. Now it was his turn. There was a moment of quiet, then the sound of something being dragged. "He's got a log," Jed said, his voice grim. "He's going to use it as a ram." The first impact was colossal. The entire cabin shuddered, and the barricaded door groaned, the wood splintering. Elspeth scrambled back to the front, her mind racing. The door wouldn't hold against another blow like that. "The floorboard," Jed yelled, understanding her desperate glance. "Do it." As Corbin drew back for a second swing, Elspeth darted forward. She ripped the rug away from the floor near the pantry and, with all her might, wrenched the loose floorboard up, exposing the dark, 4-foot drop into the root cellar below. She scrambled back just as the log crashed through the door, splintering it from its hinges. Blinded by the dim interior and his own rage, Corbin charged in, expecting to find a wounded man and a terrified woman. Instead, his leading foot found only empty air. He plunged downwards into the cellar with a shout of shock and pain, his rifle clattering uselessly to the floor above. Silence descended, broken only by Corbin's groans from the cellar below. Jed had his rifle trained on the hole, his face a mask of grim concentration. "It's over, Corbin," Jed called out, his voice ringing with authority. Elspeth stood, breathing heavily, the skillet still gripped in her hand. Her body was shaking, but her mind was clear. They had done it. They had faced the demons from Jed's past, and they had won. She looked at Jed. He was looking at her, his blue eyes filled with an awe and admiration that went far beyond gratitude. He lowered the rifle, the immediate danger past. In the wreckage of their home, surrounded by splintered wood and shattered glass, they stood as victors. He had awoken a millionaire, but it was she, the mail-order bride with her flower and her courage, who had proven to be the true treasure. He pushed himself up from his chair, wincing, and crossed the room to her. He didn't say a word. He simply reached out and took the heavy skillet from her hand, setting it gently on the table. Then he took her hand in his. His touch was warm, solid, and real. The fortune under the floor was a fact, a detail. The truth was here, in this touch, in the shared victory that had forged their two disparate lives into one. The aftermath is quiet, the silence of the valley rushing back in to fill the space left by the violence. Jedediah stands before her, not as a patient or a secret millionaire, but as the man whose life she holds in her hands, and who, in turn, holds hers. The contract that brought her here is ash, burned away in the heat of the fight. What replaces it is something solid and unwritten, a covenant forged in flour and gunpowder. He looks at the ruin of their front door, then at her, his eyes full of a truth more valuable than any gold. He promised you a home, Jed says, his voice quiet but clear. I intend to honor that promise, if you'll still have me, Elsie. Not as Jedediah Stone, the homesteader, but as Jedediah Stanton, your husband. It is not a demand or an expectation. It is a question offered with all the vulnerability of a man who has almost lost everything and just realized what is truly worth fighting for. Elspeth looks at his outstretched hand, then up into his honest, open face. She places her hand in his without hesitation. Outside, the first star of evening appears in the vast, darkening sky above their battered, victorious little cabin. It is a simple homestead carved out of the wilderness, and it is finally, truly, her home. Thanks for watching. This story showed love and heroism where least expected. What was your favorite moment of connection between them? Tell us in the comments. If you believe in compassion, overcoming prejudice, and finding love in unexpected places, give this story a like and subscribe for more.